Welcome back to History They Buried, where the past is never truly dead, just hidden. Each day we unearth the forgotten, the covered up, and the unspeakable truths buried beneath everyday lives. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Merryweather family, a seemingly ordinary couple who, over the span of 15 years, took in children nobody else wanted. But behind closed doors, something far more unsettling was taking place. At first, the case seemed confined to a quiet corner of Virginia. But the deeper historians dug, the more they uncovered chilling whispers that stretched far beyond America's borders. North Wales in the United Kingdom, Kingston in Jamaica, the silent countryside of Pennsylvania, even as far as Texas, Tennessee, Kansas, and Australia. Each place, separated by oceans and centuries, carried records of vanishing children, unexplained adoptions, and stories villagers were too frightened to speak of aloud. The Merryweathers of Virginia were only one chapter in this larger, hidden pattern. In North Wales, locals still whisper of an estate where children were heard singing behind bricked-up cellar walls long after the house had been abandoned. In Kingston, Jamaica, colonial records mention imported wards who were listed on ship ledgers one year, then vanished entirely the next. Pennsylvania's mountain towns held their own secrets, strange photographs of children with identical stares, their names erased from parish records. By the time investigators connected these scattered fragments, a horrifying question arose. Were these isolated events, or a continuous thread woven across generations and continents? The farmhouse in Virginia, the chapel in North Wales, the shipping yards of Kingston, the wooded valleys of Pennsylvania, the broken barns of Texas, the backroads of Tennessee, the Deso, late plains of Kansas, even the windswept coasts of Australia, all carried scars of something unspeakable, something carefully buried. What tied them together was not just the disappearances, but the silence that followed. Files destroyed, testimonies withdrawn, families who dared to speak, ruined. The deeper you dig, the more it feels less like history and more like a living network that never fully went away. Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls dare to confront the darkest chapters of buried history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? The Merryweather farmhouse sat just outside a fading Virginia town, the kind of place where the roads narrowed into gravel and the fields seemed endless. From a distance, it looked unremarkable. White wooden siding, a wide porch, and a small orchard stretching toward the tree line. Neighbors recalled it as a modest home belonging to a quiet couple, George and Margaret Merryweather. They weren't wealthy, but they carried themselves with the steady respectability of rural life. Yet what made them unusual wasn't the house or the land, but the children. One by one, over 15 years, children kept appearing at their doorstep. Some arrived through adoption agencies, others through church connections, and a few, it was said, came without paperwork at all. At first, the community praised the Merryweathers. In a world where abandoned children often disappeared into orphanages or workhouses, here was a couple offering them a home. But in time, people began to notice things that didn't quite add up. The children never seemed to play outside, never mixed with the town's school. No laughter carried across the fields, and when neighbors did catch glimpses, the children's appearances unsettled them. Their eyes looked too similar, their posture too rigid, as if they were rehearsing a performance no one else understood. One story circulated of a milkman making a delivery one morning. He swore he heard a chorus of voices from inside the house chanting in unison, though no words could be made out. When he mentioned it, George Merryweather simply smiled and said the children were reciting Bible verses, but the milkman stopped delivering after that day. Inside the farmhouse, rooms were slowly modified. Locks appeared on bedroom doors, not to keep intruders out, but to keep someone in. Windows were nailed shut. When he asked about it, Margaret told him it was to keep the rats away. He didn't return the next day. And then there were the photographs. A handful have survived. Cracked, faded images kept in local archives. They show groups of children standing in rows, all staring directly into the camera. None of them are smiling. Stranger still, in each photograph, at least one child looks eerily like another, as if they were the same face copied over time. The farmhouse had become a place of whispers. Some said the Merryweathers were saints rescuing the forgotten. Others said they were hiding something unspeakable. What no one realized then was that this farmhouse was not the beginning. It was only one chapter in a much larger history. Next, we step inside the locked rooms of the Merryweather farmhouse and uncover what investigators later described as a mirror turned against humanity itself. The first time investigators entered the Merryweather farmhouse, years after the couple had passed, they expected dust, decay, and the ordinary echoes of a life once lived. What they found instead was a house frozen in a kind of unnatural stillness, as though its walls were still holding their breath. Every door creaked, every floorboard groaned, but the strangest sound of all was silence. Not the soft quiet of an abandoned home, but a suffocating hush, as if the house itself was waiting. The upstairs bedrooms were the first to reveal themselves. At a glance, they looked like children's rooms, narrow beds, wooden toys, worn clothing folded neatly in drawers. But nothing looked used. The bedsheets were tucked too tight, the toys arranged too carefully, the clothes in perfect rows, as if set for display rather than for life. One of the rooms had a wall lined with mirrors, each one slightly tilted toward the center of the room. The glass was cracked in places, fogged in others, but they all seemed positioned to reflect anyone who stood in the middle. Later analysts would say the arrangement created the effect of infinite repetition, one face multiplied endlessly. It was here, perhaps, that the name Mirror Children was first whispered. More disturbing were the marks on the walls, scratches, dozens of them, running along the plaster in desperate streaks. Some curved as if made by fingernails, others gouged deeper, as though a tool had been dragged again and again. None were ever painted over. The cellar was worse. Heavy chains secured the door from the outside, their rust suggesting years of use. When finally cut open, investigators descended into a space that looked more like a holding chamber than storage. Small wooden chairs sat in rows facing a chalk-covered wall. The chalk markings were crude, shapes, numbers, and words written in jagged lines. Some were repeated endlessly, over and over, as if the writer had been forced to memorize them. In the corner lay fragments of what once might have been toys, now broken beyond recognition. But the air itself carried the heaviest weight, a sour, unshakable odor described by one investigator as a mixture of mildew and breath, trapped for decades. Photographs taken during that search are rarely shown, and many remain locked in private collections. But one image occasionally surfaces in archives, a dim shot of the cellar wall, with a faint outline of children's handprints overlapping again and again, pressed so firmly that the impressions remained even through layers of old chalk. What these rooms suggested was chilling. These children were not being raised as a family. They were being prepared for what no one yet understood. Next, we uncover the first testimonies, the voices of those who glimpsed the Merryweather children while they were still alive, and the unsettling patterns no one wanted to admit at the time. For years, the Merryweather family kept to themselves, but in a town as small as Harrowwick, secrets never stay buried for long. People began to talk, not openly at first, but in murmurs at the back of the church, in lowered voices across the grocer's counter, or whispered on the walk home after dark. One story came from Margaret Ellis, the village midwife. She claimed that late one evening in 1879, while passing the edge of the Merryweather property, she saw children standing in the upstairs window. But it wasn't their presence that chilled her. It was their stillness. They didn't move, not even to blink, she recalled in a statement decades later. It was as though they were carved from wax, only their eyes followed me as I walked. Then there was Thomas Reed, a farmer whose land bordered the Merryweathers. He swore that he often heard chanting carried on the wind, high, reedy voices repeating phrases he couldn't understand. At first he thought it was just hymns, but when he tried to listen more closely, the words broke into sharp, jarring syllables that made his stomach knot. "No child I ever heard sang like that," he muttered. Perhaps most unsettling was the account of a traveling peddler who knocked on the Merryweathers' door one rainy afternoon. He claimed a child opened the door, pale, with unnaturally dark eyes that seemed too large for their face. Behind the child, more figures lingered in the hallway, silent, watching. Before the man could even offer his wares, Ezra Merryweather appeared, slamming the door shut with a force that nearly crushed his hand. The peddler left without saying another word, and never again returned to that part of North Wales. Over time, these stories wove together into something the town couldn't ignore. Parents began to warn their children not to stray near the farmhouse. Local ministers, when pressed, advised their congregations to pray for the family and keep distance. Some whispered that the children weren't truly children at all, that perhaps the Merryweathers had brought something back with them from their years abroad. Despite the growing unease, no one confronted the couple directly. Fear and politeness bound the town in silence, even as unease grew sharper with each passing year. It was easier, perhaps, to look away, but silence does not erase truth. And soon, the Merryweathers' secret would claw its way into public view, through the testimony of those who could no longer stay quiet. Next, we'll uncover the first official investigation. The moment authorities could no longer dismiss the rumors, and the Merryweather case began to unravel. By the spring of 1881, whispers about the Merryweathers had grown too loud to ignore. The parish records showed no births, no school enrollments, and yet there were always more children at the farm. Faces changed in the windows, voices multiplied in the fields. It didn't make sense, and in a place like Harrowwick, where everyone knew everyone, such secrecy gnawed at the very order of village life. The breaking point came after the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy named Daniel Price. He was last seen walking home from the mill, his path cutting close to the Merryweather farm. By morning, his shoes were found in the mud just beyond the farmhouse fence, but Daniel himself was gone. That was when the authorities finally stepped in. Constable Edmund Holt, a stern man known for his practicality, led the inquiry. At first, Ezra and Alma Merryweather resisted, insisting that the rumors were slander, the shoes planted to shame them. But Holt wasn't convinced. Too many stories, too many sightings, too much unease. Reluctantly and under pressure from the villagers, the Merryweathers allowed the constable to search their home. The upstairs rooms revealed nothing unusual at first glance. Neat beds, children's toys, shelves lined with worn books. Yet something about the air felt wrong. Heavy, metallic, as though it clung to the lungs. Holt followed the creak of the floorboards down into the cellar. It was there, beneath the ground, that the investigation took its first sinister turn. The cellar was large, much larger than a farmhouse cellar had any right to be, with crude stone walls that seemed to stretch farther than the foundation should allow. Lantern light flickered against rows of old iron cots, lined up in careful precision. Thin wool blankets lay folded at the edges, untouched, yet damp with mildew. On the far wall, symbols had been carved into the stone. Not letters, not numbers, but something jagged and circular, repeating like an endless pattern. And then there was the sound. Holt later testified that he heard it before he saw anything, a faint, rhythmic tapping, as though many small fingers beat in unison on the cellar walls. When his lantern swayed, he caught the briefest glimpse of eyes in the shadows, not one pair but dozens, reflecting the flame with an unnatural gleam. He called out, but no voices answered, just silence. And then, as he turned to leave, one of the iron cots dragged an inch across the floor on its own. The official report would downplay what Holt found, speaking only of structural anomalies and evidence of overcrowding, but word spread differently among the villagers. They spoke of rooms that didn't belong, of children lurking underground, of things Holt refused to name. The cellar had been opened, and with it, so had the first crack in the Merryweathers' carefully maintained facade. Next, we'll reveal what happened when outside investigators were called in, bringing with them questions the family could no longer deflect. The cellar should have been the end of it. For most villages, a discovery like that would have been locked away in whispers and forgotten under the weight of shame. But Harrowick was not so fortunate. What Constable Holt saw that day bled beyond the stone walls of the Merryweather farm, drawing attention from far beyond the village. Within months, a series of letters began to circulate. Accounts written in cautious, trembling hands by those who had visited the cellar. Holt's report, already thin, was contradicted by testimony from a parish clerk who claimed he had seen far more than Holt admitted. Soon, rumors drifted overseas. By late 1881, investigators had arrived from Pennsylvania, men already entangled in reports of abandoned children found in coal towns, their eyes clouded white as if they had lived too long in the dark. They had heard of Harrowick, and they came not to solve the mystery, but to see if the stories matched their own. From Kingston, Jamaica, a clergyman named Father Arkwright traveled across the Atlantic. He brought with him documents from the Caribbean, tales of children who did not belong to this world, children born not from their mothers' wombs, but from mirrors and reflections. In Kingston, he said, such things were whispered of only in hushed prayers, yet he had followed the trail all the way to England, believing Harrowick was the missing piece of a larger puzzle. The villagers were not prepared for these outsiders. They brought questions the Merryweathers couldn't simply dismiss. Why did no records exist for half the children seen on the farm? Why did drawings of the cellar symbols match carvings found in abandoned mission schools in Jamaica? And why did miners in Pennsylvania describe hearing the same tapping and dozens of tiny fingers deep inside uncharted mine shafts? The Merryweathers tried to maintain their composure. Alma insisted the stories were wild exaggerations. Ezra, cold and controlled as ever, threatened lawsuits, accusing the investigators of slander. Yet even as he spoke, children peered from the farmhouse windows with hollow, unblinking eyes, and more than one visitor swore the glass panes trembled as though something pressed against them from the inside. Father Arkwright described the experience in a letter to his bishop. The Merryweather home is not merely a place, it is a vessel. Within it resides a presence older than the family itself, and the children, if children they can be called, are both its prisoners and its servants. For the first time, the villagers realized this was not just a local tragedy. Harrowick's secret stretched across oceans, connecting farms in England to coal towns in America, to mission schools in Jamaica, and if the investigators were right, the Merryweathers had not created their horror, they had inherited it. Next, we uncover what happens when the investigators attempt to enter the cellar again, and what they find waiting that refuses to be explained by faith or science. By autumn of 1881, the pressure had become unbearable. Outsiders demanded access, villagers whispered accusations, and Holt himself, haunted by the first descent, refused to go near the Merryweather farm again. Yet Father Arkwright and the Americans insisted. If the cellar held proof, it had to be seen, documented, and, if possible, destroyed. On a cold October evening, lanterns in hand, a party of 6 made their way across the muddy fields. The farmhouse loomed against the dying light, its windows dark and lifeless. Ezra met them at the door, silent and grim, his refusal written in every line of his face. But Alma, strangely calm, unlocked the door and led them inside. Some later swore she was smiling. The cellar door had not been opened in months. Dust lined the steps, the key turned with a scream of rust. As the group descended, their lamps revealed what Holt's original report had not described in full. The walls were not only marked with chalk drawings, but carved deeply into the stone. Spirals, eyes, and human figures with no mouths. Some were old, worn almost smooth. Others were fresh, their edges sharp as if cut by a steady, deliberate hand. Then came the smell. Not rot exactly, but something damp, metallic, and ancient, like water drawn from the deepest earth. Father Arkwright held his cross before him, muttering prayers under his breath. The Americans sketched frantically, desperate to preserve what they saw. One bent to touch the carvings, and recoiled as the stone pulsed faintly warm under his fingers. At the far wall stood the mirror. Tall, cracked at one corner, its frame blackened with age. The villagers had spoken of it in whispers, but here it was, unmistakable. The surface reflected their lanterns strangely, as if the glass resisted their light. For a moment, each man saw not himself, but a distorted double staring back, features blurred, eyes wide and pale. And then came the sound. At first, a faint scratching, then a tap, then dozens of taps, as if tiny fingers drummed against the other side of the glass. One of the Americans dropped his lantern. The cellar plunged into half-shadow, flames flickering wildly against the carvings. From the farmhouse above, villagers later reported hearing a low chorus, not of children laughing, but of children humming in perfect, inhuman unison. The investigators fled. Father Arkwright alone lingered, transfixed by the mirror. When the others dragged him out, he was weeping, clutching his cross so tightly his palm bled. That night, he wrote only one sentence in his journal. It was not a reflection, it was a doorway. Next, we uncover what the villagers themselves began to suspect, that the Merryweathers had not only hidden something beneath their home, but fed it. In the weeks that followed the second descent, a sickness settled over North Wales. Children complained of nightmares. Farmers found their animals dead in the fields with eyes clouded white, and the village well, long considered pure, began to taste of iron. People whispered the word curse, but most reserved their blame for the Merryweathers. The cellar, they said, was not simply a hiding place. It was a mouth, and Ezra and Alma Merryweather had been feeding it for years. Villagers recalled details they had long ignored. The way Alma often visited homes where infants had recently died, offering prayers but never tears. Ezra's habit of burning scraps of children's clothing in his field under cover of darkness. The fact that the couple's supposed orphans were never seen in church, nor at play in the meadows. It was Mrs. Llewellyn, the miller's widow, who finally broke her silence. She told the Americans that she had seen it with her own eyes. One evening, as she carried water from the well, she spotted Ezra leading 2 children, barefoot, pale, their hair tangled like they hadn't been washed in months, down into the cellar. The door slammed shut. Minutes later, a low humming rose from the ground itself, carrying through the stones like a heartbeat. She had heard it every night since. Others stepped forward with stories that, once spoken aloud, could no longer be dismissed. A shepherd claimed he once passed the farmhouse at dusk and saw Alma crouched before the mirror, rocking back and forth as dozens of tiny hands pressed against the glass from the other side. A schoolteacher swore she marked 3 children absent for weeks, only for their families to insist they'd never had those children in the first place. Fear became a fever. Neighbors began keeping their doors bolted, not just against the Merryweathers, but against the possibility of their own children being taken in the night. Some tried to petition the magistrate for action, but each time, records went missing or officials brushed the case aside. It was as if some force wanted the story buried. By November, villagers gathered in secret to discuss burning the farmhouse to the ground, but each time the plan neared action, something intervened. Sudden storms, unexplained accidents, even the mysterious deaths of those most outspoken. Father Arkwright himself warned them, "You think to destroy it, but you would only loose what it holds. Better a sealed grave than an open pit." Still, in every whispered gathering, one truth hardened like stone. The Merryweathers had not been unlucky caretakers of a haunted cellar. They had been chosen, and worse still, they had obeyed. Next, we uncover the first international connections from Pennsylvania to Kingston, where reports of similar mirrors and vanishing children emerged. Was this truly a Welsh curse, or part of something much larger? The villagers of North Wales thought their nightmare was confined to the shadows of their valley, but as investigators dug deeper into the Merryweathers' past, disturbing letters and records surfaced. Hints that the farmhouse was just one echo in a much larger chorus of horror. The first clue came from Pennsylvania. In 1872, a Quaker family recorded strange disturbances after inheriting an oak-framed mirror shipped from Europe. Children in their town began vanishing, always last seen near the family's home. When the mirror was finally destroyed, its glass shattered not into pieces, but into a powder fine as ash. The family fled, leaving behind a cellar lined with claw marks in the stone. Then came Kingston, Jamaica. Missionary archives revealed that enslaved children were often warned not to wander near a particular plantation house where a grand Venetian mirror stood in the main hall. Survivors swore the glass swallowed voices at night, leaving the halls echoing with cries no human throat could make. That plantation's owner, a cousin of Alma Merryweather, even Cleveland, Texas, nearly a century later, bore whispers of the same curse. Residents remembered an abandoned farmhouse where children dared each other to look into a cracked mirror. Local legends claimed that those who stared too long vanished from their beds within weeks. Lawmen dismissed it as folklore, but the missing persons files remain unsolved. The parallels chilled the few who dared piece them together. From Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, where an isolated family was said to breed children of the glass, to Kansas prairies, where a preacher warned of mirrors that showed not reflections but futures, the trail stretched across continents. Even in Australia, settlers wrote of devil mirrors traded among convicts, their silvered surfaces dimming after every disappearance, and every trail, every way. Spur, every archive note circled back to the same symbol, a family that kept itself hidden, shrouded in secrecy, always appearing wherever these cursed mirrors surfaced, sometimes called caretakers, sometimes thieves, sometimes saints. But to those who saw the truth, they were feeders. The Merryweathers were not alone, they were part of a network. What terrified the villagers most wasn't the possibility of one haunted farmhouse. It was the dawning realization that children had been disappearing across the world for decades, and nobody wanted the stories connected. Officials erased records, churches denied involvement, families too ashamed to speak buried their grief in silence. But silence only deepened the pattern. Next, we step into Tennessee, where the whispers of mirror-born children became more than folklore, where an entire settlement vanished without explanation. Was it the curse of the Merryweathers, or had something far older claimed its due? By the mid-1800s, whispers of cursed mirrors had already crossed oceans and infiltrated villages, but nowhere was the evidence more chilling than in a forgotten pocket of Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, where an entire settlement seemed to vanish into thin air. The place was called Ridge Hollow, a small cluster of 23 families, mostly farmers and lumber workers who lived quietly along the river valleys. At first, their story sounded like another rural tragedy, families moving away, crops failing, livelihoods abandoned, but what researchers found in the scattered records suggested something far stranger. A missionary passing through in 1847 wrote of children who seemed not of the earth, pale and reflective as glass, their eyes catching the firelight unnaturally. He described a family who kept a mirror taller than any man, dragged from England in a crate so heavy it took 4 mules to carry it. Locals said the family claimed it was an heirloom, a gift from European relatives who once lived in North Wales. By the spring of 1849, reports darkened. Neighboring towns noticed Ridge Hollow no longer traded grain or livestock. Mail went unanswered. A sheriff's patrol sent into the valley returned with strange accounts. Homes standing empty, food still set at tables, fires smouldering in hearths as if abandoned in haste. The livestock remained, gaunt and pacing restlessly, their eyes fixed on doorways where no one entered. And then there was the church. Its floorboards were split open, the altar shoved aside, and beneath it, an upright mirror, half buried in the soil, its frame decorated with the same curling patterns that matched the Merryweather farmhouse in Wales. Etched across the base in faint scratches were words no one could agree upon, though several claimed it read, "They went through." But through to where? One of the sheriff's men, a young deputy Spobio, or he saw movement in the mirror when the others turned away, not his own reflection, but the pale faces of children pressed against the other side of the glass, their mouths open in silent cries. He left the force weeks later, consumed by drink, insisting that he dreamt every night of Ridge Hollow's children pounding on the inside of a window, begging to be let out. By the time state officials arrived months later, the settlement had been wiped from maps. The mirror was gone, removed or buried, its whereabouts still unknown. Ridge Hollow was never resettled. The forest reclaimed it, erasing every trace but fragments of foundations beneath the leaves. What lingers, however, are the patterns. Tennessee locals pass down the tale of the mirror-born, children who appear in certain families, uninvited, their faces unnaturally symmetrical, their eyes reflecting candlelight too brightly. Folklorists dismiss it as myth, but the archives tell a harsher truth. Multiple birth registries from the area record children who were never seen again, names listed without graves, entire lineages that end in silence. The question wasn't simply what happened to Ridge Hollow. It was why the story was never allowed to spread beyond the Smokies. Church records stopped. State files disappeared. Newspapers mentioned the settlement only once before moving on, as if someone had pulled a veil across the memory. And in that silence, the legend grew, connecting Ridge Hollow to the Merryweathers, to Kingston, to Pennsylvania, and beyond. Every mirror, every disappearance, every erased record seemed like pieces of the same puzzle, a puzzle that once seen cannot be unseen. Next, we uncover what happened in Kansas, where a preacher's sermons warned of mirrors that showed not reflections, but the futures of those who dared look. Some futures ended in graves, others simply ended. By 1852, the legend of cursed mirrors had drifted westward into the frontier towns of Kansas. It was here that a fiery preacher named Reverend Silas Whitcomb first began warning his congregation of the glass that sees beyond God's creation. Whitcomb was no ordinary preacher. He had grown up in North Wales before immigrating to America as a boy. His father had been a stonemason, and according to whispered records, briefly employed at the Merryweather estate before the tragedy unfolded there. Whether by blood or by memory, Whitcomb seemed tethered to the same dark legacy. In the town of Marrow Creek, Kansas, Whitcomb's sermons drew crowds from miles around. He thundered from the pulpit that Satan's instruments were already among them, disguised not as idols or witches, but as mirrors. He claimed that reflections were not merely images of ourselves, but windows into places mankind was never meant to gaze upon. At first, people dismissed his words as fire and brimstone theatrics, yet his descriptions unsettled many. Mirrors that showed children's faces no one recognized, mirrors that bled when touched, mirrors that foretold the exact day of a person's death. And then, the demonstrations began. Whitcomb would invite members of the congregation to step forward and gaze into a tall, unframed mirror propped against the church wall. According to diary fragments, some swore they saw nothing unusual, but others staggered back pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. One woman, Sarah Holt, screamed in front of the crowd that she had seen her son drowning in black water. Days later, the boy fell into the river during a storm and was never recovered. Word spread quickly, and with it, fear. Parents forbade their children from attending services. Some claimed Whitcomb was no preacher at all, but a vessel of something unholy. Others whispered he was mere by exposing what had already cursed the town. By winter of 1853, tragedy reached its peak. 20 children vanished over a span of 3 nights. Their beds were found undisturbed, their shoes still by the doors, their parents swearing they had locked the home securely. The only clue, in each house a mirror stood uncovered, and in each mirror, villagers reported smudges shaped like small handprints pressed against the inside of the glass. When confronted, Whitcomb did not deny his involvement. Instead, he preached with greater fury, declaring that the children were not lost, but delivered. He claimed they had been called into the promised reflection, a world purer than this one, untainted by sin. Authorities moved to arrest him, but by the time they arrived, both Whitcomb and his church were gone. The building had burned to the ground in a fire that left no trace of the preacher's body. The only object found intact was the tall mirror, its surface blackened yet unbroken, lying in the ashes. Locals buried the mirror deep in the prairie soil, praying it would never be unearthed. But decades later, when rail lines were laid across the region, workers uncovered a shattered mirror frame with strange markings. eerily similar to the patterns found in Tennessee and Wales. The Whitcomb prophecy lived on. In the generations that followed, Kansan mothers told their children never to look too long into a mirror at night, lest they see not themselves, but something waiting on the other side. Next, we travel to Australia, where settlers recorded one of the most terrifying encounters with the mirrors, a mining town where dozens of workers claimed the reflections in their lantern glass were not their own, but strangers staring back. Australia's gold rush promised fortune, but for many settlers it delivered only hardship, disease, and death. In the 1860s, deep in the mining settlement of Broken Ridge, Victoria, whispers began about something darker than starvation or cave-ins. Miners spoke of a presence that stalked them not in the tunnels, but in the light of their own lanterns. It started innocently enough. Men returning from the shafts at night swore they had glimpsed faces in the glass of their lamps, faces that did not belong to them. Some described pale children pressing against the curved glass, mouths moving as though calling out silently. Others claimed they saw their wives weeping, or their own corpses lying still. One miner, Patrick O'Connell, laughed off the tales until his comrades dragged him into the tavern one evening, pale as bone. He had been working the shafts alone when he raised his lantern and saw, clear as day, the reflection of a child's hand clutching his shoulder. When he spun around, the tunnel was empty. Within the week, O'Connell disappeared underground. His body was never recovered, though his lamp was found still burning, with a cracked glass smeared on the inside with what looked like ash handprints. Soon, it wasn't only lanterns. Wash basins of water in the camp showed images of people no one could identify. Miners shaving in the morning claimed the reflections moved independently of their own motions, and in more than one case, men swore that when they leaned too close, their reflections smiled back, long after they themselves had stopped. By the winter of 1863, the settlement was collapsing into terror. Children of the camp began reporting voices calling to them from mirrors and window glass, promising treasures buried deeper than gold. One boy told his mother that the children in the glass wanted him to play. The next morning he was gone, vanished without a footprint in the red dust. Local authorities attempted to explain the disappearances as desertion or drunken misadventure, but the stories could not be silenced. Miners kept diaries sketching crude drawings of the mirror children they swore were watching them from every reflective surface. One chilling entry found in a half-buried journal read, "They wait in the glass, hungry. They take the smallest first." The final straw came in the spring of 1864, when an entire night shift failed to return from the shafts. 30 men gone. Their tools were found neatly stacked, their food untouched, their lamps all shattered at the bottom of the tunnels. But when survivors tried to descend, they reported hearing a chorus of children's voices echoing through the rock, as if dozens were laughing just out of sight. Broken Ridge was abandoned within a month. Today, little remains but scattered foundations and collapsed shafts. Yet local lore persists. Travelers swear that when the sun sets over the desert stones, the windows of derelict huts shimmer with faces, thin, watching, and unblinking. And the detail that ties it back? Among the abandoned ruins, archaeologists later uncovered a mirror fragment etched with the same markings found in Wales, Tennessee, and Kansas, as though the curse itself had traveled across oceans, following those who sought to escape it. Next, we'll uncover how the mirror legend circled back to America, this time in Cleveland, Texas, where families reported an entire town haunted by reflections that refused to stay still. By the late 19th century, the railway had carried settlers deep into the pine forests of Cleveland, Texas. Families came chasing lumber fortunes, cattle trade, and the promise of stability. But what they found instead was a shadow stretching across the whole community, a curse that seemed to arrive with them, sewn invisibly into their new lives. It began, as it always did, with children. In 1892, teachers at the small one-room schoolhouse noticed their pupils behaving strangely. Children stared far too long into the window glass, giggling at something no one else could see. A girl named Sarah Mayfield, only 8 years old, startled her teacher by announcing that the other children in the glass wanted her to come play outside. When asked who she meant, Sarah simply pointed to the window pane where her reflection stood perfectly still, even though Sarah herself had turned away. Within weeks, parents complained of children waking in the night, whispering to mirrors as though speaking with unseen friends. Some were found standing in the yard at dawn, barefoot and shivering, claiming they had been invited out by the faces in their windows. The turning point came during the summer fair of 1894. Dozens of families gathered in town square, where vendors had hung polished tin and glass panes to reflect the lantern light. As the music played, screams erupted. Witnesses swore that in every mirror, the faces staring back were not their own. Some saw gaunt, wide-eyed children with hollow cheeks. Others claimed the reflections were of themselves, aged decades older, corpses staring from glass. The fair ended in chaos, with half the town fleeing before the night was over. And then the disappearances began. First, a boy named Thomas was gone, his bed empty save for a small shard of mirror glass on the pillow. Then a young mother was found wandering the edge of the pine forest, incoherent, claiming she had been pulled halfway through the glass before her husband grabbed her. Her arms were cut with long, fine scratches, as though from shattered crystal. Cleveland's sheriff attempted to restore order, blaming hysteria, even suggesting local children were running away into the woods. But the truth was harder to ignore. Households locked or covered their mirrors, some smashing every reflective surface they owned. But even then, the curse found ways to intrude. One family swore that reflections began appearing in the water trough, shimmering at night with pale faces staring up from beneath the surface. Another claimed the glass of their windows fogged over from the inside, letters spelling words no hand had written. The legend spread fast. Cleveland's reflections steal the living. By 1895, travelers along the rail line avoided the settlement altogether, leaving behind a town hollowed by fear. Many homes were abandoned, their windows shattered out, curtains nailed across frames. But the most chilling evidence of all came when surveyors documented an old farmhouse just outside town. Inside, they discovered a single upright mirror left untouched. Its surface was darkened, almost liquid-like. And there, etched faintly along its wooden frame, were the exact same foreign markings already found in North Wales and Broken Ridge, Australia. For many, it was undeniable proof. The curse was not local. It was following people across oceans and states, embedding itself in every settlement where families sought safety, feeding on those too young or too curious to resist its call. Next, in Tennessee, the haunting intensifies, this time tying into one of America's most infamous legends, the Bell Witch. What happens when folklore and the mirror curse collide? To understand how far this curse may reach, we must step into one of the most infamous hauntings in American folklore, the Bell Witch of Tennessee. For generations, the story has been told of John Bell and his family in Adams, Tennessee, who in the early 1800s suffered a haunting so terrifying it drew crowds from miles away. Voices in the night, violent attacks, even the mysterious death of John Bell himself, all were attributed to a vengeful spirit, a witch who had sworn to torment the family for eternity. But what if the truth was far more unsettling? Hidden among scattered testimonies of the Bell Witch case is a detail often overlooked. Reports of mirrors covered in the Bell household. Surviving documents mention that the family avoided reflective surfaces, claiming they invited her in. Visitors described strange distortions in glass windows, faces not their own staring back at them, and children seen talking quietly to their reflections long before the torment escalated. One account, buried in a local church archive, describes the Bell's eldest daughter awakening at night to see her reflection sitting upright in a chair beside her bed, even though she herself was still lying down. This was nearly 2 decades before the Bell Witch began its notorious attacks. Could it be that what the Bells encountered wasn't a witch at all, but the very same mirror-bound curse we've been tracing from North Wales, Jamaica, and Texas? The timeline matches chillingly well. The Bell family had connections to settlers from Pennsylvania and North Carolina, both regions where whispers of cursed children had circulated. When the family moved to Adams, Tennessee, they may have unknowingly brought the curse with them, embedding it into local folklore under the name of the Bell Witch. The curse always thrives where folklore can mask it. In Adams, it wore the face of a witch. In Cleve land, it appeared as stolen reflections. In North Wales, it was blamed on changelings, but the behavior is the same. Children pulled toward glass, voices calling from the dark, lives unraveled by something unseen. And one particularly grim detail lingers. John Bell's official cause of death was listed as poisoning by a strange black liquid. According to witnesses, the liquid was found in a vial on the family farm. No one could identify it, but when poured into a spoon and held to the light, it reflected no flame, no image, as if it swallowed reflections whole. Could that vial have been residue of the same curse, something drawn out of a mirror, something never meant to exist outside its glass prison? The legend of the Bell Witch has never truly ended. Visitors to the area still report hearing whispers, seeing children's faces in windows of the old Bell land. Skeptics laugh it off as folklore, but those who've studied the mirror curse see it differently. Adams, Tennessee wasn't haunted by a witch. It was the curse, wearing yet another mask. And if that's true, then it may not just be folklore we're dealing with, but a force carefully embedding itself in history, generation after generation. Next, in Kansas, we step into America's bloody frontier years, where the curse didn't just haunt families, but entire settlements disappeared without a trace. By the mid-1800s, Kansas was not just a frontier, it was a battlefield. Known for Bleeding Kansas, the territory was torn apart by violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. But in the shadow of political conflict, another history quietly unfolded, one that few dared to speak about. Scattered across county archives and half-finished census records are strange gaps. Whole settlements recorded one year, gone the next. No war, no fire, no mass migration noted, just absence. The kind of absence that doesn't leave tracks. In 1854, a small settlement near Osawatomie was founded by 3 farming families from Pennsylvania. For 2 years, records show harvest reports, baptisms, marriages. Then suddenly, silence. No graves, no sales of land, no relocation documents. Even the buildings were said to have rotted faster than normal, as if something had consumed the place from the inside. When a later wagon train stumbled upon the site, they found only shattered mirror glass in the dirt, reflecting nothing but darkness. The story spread among locals who called the place the Hollow Settlement. Witnesses claimed that the town's children had begun playing strange games with water troughs and window panes, whispering about friends inside. One surviving diary from a nearby farm recounts how a settler visited the place just before it disappeared. He wrote, "There are no birds, no sound, only children's laughter echoing where no children stand. Their mothers say the mirrors have grown restless, and I saw one child's reflection walking behind me, though the child stood still." The parallels to what we've traced through North Wales, Jamaica, Texas, and Tennessee are impossible to ignore. Every time the curse surfaces, children become its first doorway. And in Kansas, it didn't just claim a family, it swallowed a whole community. Local folklore, shaped by the violence of the time, blamed raiding parties or hidden massacres. But no remains were ever found. Nothing but mirrors. Some even whispered that the Bell Witch herself had moved west, haunting pioneers who broke new ground. But when placed in the context of the mirror curse, the disappearances looked less like random tragedy and more like another feeding. For historians, these gaps are brushed off as clerical error or unrecorded migration. But for those who dig deeper, the Hollow Settlement becomes a chilling warning. Wherever mirrors exist, the curse finds a way to root itself. And in Kansas, it didn't just leave behind fear, it left a message. One wagon traveler claimed that scratched into the wood of the last remaining cabin were 3 words, jagged as if carved by broken glass. "We are here." Next, we leave the frontier behind and cross oceans to Australia, where settlers carried more than supplies into the outback. They carried their ghosts, and the curse found a new home across the sea. When settlers left Europe and America to begin new lives in Australia, many believed they were escaping history itself. The colonies were seen as untouched, free from the blood-soaked curses of the Old World. But the outback has always had a way of magnifying silence, making it impossible to ignore what followed you across the sea. By the 1860s, stories began circulating through New South Wales and Queensland of children disappearing in isolated settlements. Not kidnapped, not lost to the wilderness, but vanishing inside their own homes. Families described the same chilling details we've traced across continents. Children whispering to reflections, glass panes fogging over with handprints from the inside. One haunting record comes from a missionary's journal near Bathurst. The boy went to fetch water. His mother watched him from the window. He smiled, waved, then stepped forward, but not into the yard, into the glass. The pain rippled like water, and he was gone. No sound, no trace. The journal was confiscated by church authorities, labeled heresy. But whispers spread among settlers who gave the area a name still remembered in fragments: the glassing grounds. Travelers reported mirrors hanging from trees, as if placed there deliberately, reflecting only shadows that didn't belong to anyone nearby. At night, the settlers swore they heard the sound of children playing in the dry wind, laughter carried across miles of empty desert. But the games always ended with screams. Even Aboriginal communities who had their own ancient stories of shadow spirits living between surfaces of water and stone warned the settlers not to bring mirrors deep into the land. Some elders claimed the newcomers had brought a sickness from across the sea, a sickness that fed on children through glass. The parallels are impossible to dismiss. North Wales, Kingston, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, Kansas, and now Australia. Each time the pattern is the same. The curse doesn't stay contained. It moves, it spreads with migration, carried like a parasite, and everywhere it takes root, it leaves the same silence, the same disappearance, the same broken glass. Perhaps most chilling of all, when a survey team returned years later to map the abandoned camp, they found a mirror buried upright in the red soil. The reflection did not show the surveyors. It showed rows of children standing still, waiting. One of the men smashed the glass in panic, but in the moment it shattered, he swore he heard dozens of voices scream, not from the air around him, but from inside his own chest. Australia had become yet another stage for the curse, and it was clear now. This was no local haunting. This was a migration of horror, following humanity wherever it went. Next, we circled back across the globe, returning not to new frontiers, but to old graves. Because in the 20th century, researchers tried to connect these stories only to discover that the curse was far from finished. What they uncovered was worse than anything the pioneers had faced. By the early 20th century, society had changed. Railways crossed continents, telegrams linked nations, and the world was convinced it had outgrown superstition. Yet in the dusty corners of archives and forgotten libraries, a few determined researchers began noticing something disturbing, a trail of disappearances spanning continents and centuries, all bound by the same eerie detail: mirrors. It began with Dr. Harold Wilcox, a historian at a small university in Pennsylvania. He stumbled across an unpublished missionaries' journal from Australia describing the Bathurst boy vanishing into glass. The entry was almost identical to cases he had already encountered while studying colonial disappearances in Jamaica and Kansas. The dates didn't overlap, the families weren't connected, yet the details were identical. Wilcox wasn't alone. Across the Atlantic in London's Public Records Office, another researcher, Margaret Llewellyn, was quietly compiling a list of children who had vanished inside their own homes. No forced entry, no ransom notes, no trails, just gone. In one case, a North Wales family swore they saw their daughter pressed against the inside of the mirror, her lips moving, but her voice muffled like she was underwater. When Wilcox and Llewellyn compared notes, the scale was undeniable. What they uncovered wasn't folklore, it was a systematic phenomenon buried under official silence. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they met. Police records were sealed, missionary journals went missing, and in some cases, entire files were destroyed. A pattern of cover-ups began to emerge. One government memo even used the phrase, "We must prevent another mirror panic." The implication was staggering. This wasn't the first time authorities had silenced mass hysteria linked to mirrors. By the 1920s, whispers of the so-called mirror children had leaked into private circles. Newspapers avoided the subject, dismissing it as colonial ghost tales. But among archivists and historians, the evidence became impossible to ignore. In photographs, researchers began noticing strange anomalies, children blurred, doubled, or facing the wrong way in their own reflections. One chilling account comes from a London photographer who refused to develop a family portrait. When pressed, he explained, "Because the mother's face reflected twice, but the child's, not at all." The world thought it was moving forward into modernity, but the truth was clear. The curse had evolved with it. What had once been whispered around campfires was now embedded in archives, hidden in suppressed files, scattered across the globe. And those who studied it too closely, many didn't live long enough to publish their findings. Llewellyn herself disappeared from her London flat in 1928. The mirror in her sitting room was found shattered, but the shards reflected not her empty apartment. They showed her still sitting there, writing as though she had never left. Next, we peel back the silence further into the mid-20th century, when eyewitness testimonies began surfacing publicly once again. This time, it wasn't whispers in colonial settlements. It was children vanishing in modern towns, in the age of electricity and cameras. What happens when a curse refuses to stay buried in history? By the 1950s, the world had changed. Electric lights banished shadows, televisions brought entertainment into every living room, and people believed the age of ghosts and curses was long behind them. But the mirror children curse refused to stay buried. It began resurfacing, not in colonial settlements or folklore, but in ordinary modern towns where families felt safest. The first modern case that drew public attention came from Cleveland, Texas in 1952. 8-year-old Jacob Miller was last seen brushing his teeth before bed. His mother later told police that when she went to check on him, the bathroom light was still on. The toothbrush lay in the sink, water running. The only strange detail she reported was the mirror. Jacob's toothbrush was visible on the sink in the reflection, but Jacob himself wasn't. His reflection had vanished before he did. Just 3 years later, across the ocean in North Wales, UK, a nearly identical case stunned the quiet town of Conwy. 11-year-old Mary Evans disappeared in her own bedroom while her parents sat downstairs watching television. The police found no forced entry, no footprints, no broken locks, but one officer later confided to a priest that the girl's bed was perfectly made, yet her face appeared faintly in the wardrobe mirror, eyes wide open, as if staring out from the other side. That officer left the force within weeks and refused to ever speak of the case again. By the 1960s, scattered reports were surfacing from Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and even Kingston, Jamaica. Parents described the same haunting detail, children whispering that their reflections moved when they didn't, or that someone was standing behind the glass when the room was empty. In one chilling account from Pennsylvania, a young boy told his grandmother, "My reflection doesn't like me anymore." He was gone the next morning. The press rarely covered the disappearances. When they did, the articles were vague, buried in back pages, chalked up to runaway cases or family negligence. But among investigators, rumors spread of a forbidden archive, files that hinted these weren't isolated incidents at all, but part of a repeating pattern stretching back centuries. Then came Australia, 1967. A family photograph captured at a picnic near Sydney shocked everyone who later saw it. The group smiled around the table, every face visible except for the youngest daughter, Abigail. In her seat sat a faint outline, almost like smoke, but no solid figure. Her reflection in the glass window behind them showed her clearly, smiling as if nothing were wrong. 2 weeks later, Abigail vanished without a trace. The more cases appeared, the harder it became to dismiss them as coincidence, and yet every official attempt to catalogue or investigate these disappearances ended the same way: files sealed, evidence misplaced, witnesses silenced. The curse had survived the passage of time, adapting itself to the modern world. And for those who dared to speak of it, there was a chilling consistency. The mirrors never lied. They showed what the world refused to admit. Next, we confront the escalation, the 1970s and 1980s, when for the first time, entire communities began whispering of mirror towns, streets and neighborhoods plagued by multiple child vanishings within a single year. What happens when the curse doesn't take one, but many? By the mid-1970s, something terrifying shifted. The curse of the mirror children was no longer confined to isolated homes or single tragic families. Whole communities began to whisper of towns where mirrors seemed to breathe, where vanishings didn't just happen once, but again and again, until the entire place carried the weight of fear. The most infamous of these sites was a quiet neighborhood in Tennessee, 1974. Within a span of just 9 months, 5 children from the same 2 streets disappeared without explanation. No signs of forced entry, no ransom notes, no suspects. The only detail that united the cases was that every family mentioned their child had recently spoken about their mirror. "It blinks when I don't," one girl said. Another boy confided, "There's someone in my reflection, but it isn't me." Neighbors grew frantic. Curtains stayed drawn day and night. Families covered mirrors with sheets. Some even smashed every reflective surface in their homes. But the disappearances did not stop. By Christmas, the community had hollow eyes and restless hearts, afraid to even look at their own faces in a bathroom sink. Then came Pennsylvania, 1978. A factory town on the edge of collapse was already struggling with layoffs and poverty when a string of vanishings tore through its streets. 10 children vanished in under 2 years. The town's priest broke down during a Sunday sermon, admitting he could not explain what was happening. Later, locals swore that even the church's crucifix reflected strangely in the polished floor. Christ's face blurred, distorted, almost as if someone else was staring back. Far across the sea in North Wales, 1981, the village of Blaenau Festiniog experienced its own mirror plague. 4 cousins disappeared from the same farmhouse over 3 summers. One surviving sibling told investigators, "It's not that they were taken, it's that they stepped inside the glass. I saw it. They walked into it, and then they were gone." The officer dismissed the child's testimony at the time, but decades later, that statement would resurface in secret police archives. In Kingston, Jamaica, 1984, mothers whispered of the Glass Man, a figure who appeared only in reflections, calling children closer. Some swore they saw handprints forming from the inside of a mirror, pressing outward, smudging the glass. A local teacher, desperate to protect her students, had every mirror removed from the school. Still, 2 of her pupils vanished within weeks. But perhaps the most unsettling case came from Australia, 1987. On an ordinary summer afternoon, 6 children playing in a cul-de-sac vanished within the same hour. Witnesses saw nothing, heard nothing, except one boy who claimed the street windows all shimmered at once, like water rippling after a stone had been thrown. No bodies were ever found. To this day, that neighborhood is called the Hollow Street, and no family dares to move in. By the end of the 1980s, the term mirror towns had begun circulating among journalists and academics who dared whisper the truth. These were not random tragedies. They were part of a system, a cycle repeating across borders and generations. And yet, the most haunting question remained: if entire towns could be swallowed, what stopped the curse from spreading further, until no place on Earth was safe? Next, we uncover the chilling truth. The 1990s and early 2000s, when technology brought new ways of seeing, and horrifyingly, the mirrors began showing themselves on film, in photographs, and in home video footage. For the first time, the curse left behind undeniable evidence. By the early 1990s, technology brought a cruel twist. Families had long been dismissed as hysterical, their accounts reduced to superstition, but suddenly, photographs and videotapes began capturing things no one could explain, things that should not have been there. The first case surfaced in Cleveland, Texas, 1991. A mother testing out her new camcorder at her daughter's birthday later replayed the tape only to freeze in horror. In the footage, as the children laugh around the cake, the hallway mirror flickers. For a split second, her daughter's reflection does not move in sync with her body. The girl is blowing candles, but her reflection only stares back, expressionless, unblinking. The mother swore she never noticed it in real time. Within 2 weeks, her daughter was gone. Police dismissed the tape as a glitch, but those who viewed it privately admitted the footage carried a wrongness they could not explain. One officer resigned shortly after, saying he would never forget the eyes in the mirror. Then, in Tennessee, 1993, a local newspaper published photographs of a missing boy's bedroom. When the images were later archived, staff noticed something no one had pointed out before. In the dresser mirror, a pale figure stood behind the boy, its face blurred and stretched as if smeared across the glass. No one else had been in the room when the picture was taken. The newspaper quietly pulled the story from its files. But the most infamous case came in Pennsylvania, 1996. During a school recital, multiple parents recorded the event. On every tape, one child who would vanish just days later appears doubled in the reflection of a tall glass window. The second version of the child stood completely still, even as the real boy on stage moved and sang. Investigators never released the tapes to the public, but rumors spread and fragments leaked years later. Even in GSA's any copies, the sight is unbearable. Across the ocean, in North Wales, 1998, a tourist photo taken in a slate mine revealed what looked like dozens of tiny handprints pressed against the walls of a cracked mirror on display. Locals swore the mine had no such mirror, and the object has never been found since. The photograph remains in a private collection, whispered about but never formally published. Meanwhile, in Australia, 2001, a family portrait became the centerpiece of debate. The smiling family of 5 posed in their living room, but when the photograph developed, a 6th child appeared in the reflection of the cabinet glass. A boy no one recognized. His features were faintly warped, as if pressed against the barrier of the photo itself. The family left their home weeks later, abandoning nearly everything. By the early 2000s, a chilling realization took hold. The mirror children were no longer just an oral legend, nor merely unexplained vanishings. There was evidence now, visual, recorded, undeniable. But every piece of evidence came with the same pattern. The child caught in the glass would soon vanish, as if the reflection had marked them, claimed them, drawn them in. And still, even with proof in hand, authorities buried the files, confiscated tapes, destroyed negatives. The question lingered like a curse. What were they so afraid the world would see? Next, Section 21, when the digital age arrives and the mirrors begin haunting not just glass, but screens. For the first time, the curse spreads into the world of computers, webcams, and early internet chat rooms. By the early 2000s, the world had changed. Families were no longer gathered around polished dressers or hallway mirrors. They were gathered around glowing screens, computers, televisions, and later, phones. And yet, the curse adapted. It began quietly in Pennsylvania, 2002. A teenager joined a late-night internet chat room. His webcam, grainy and pixelated, showed his bedroom behind him. At first, nothing seemed strange, but other users in the chat insisted they could see someone else in the frame, a child sitting silently in the shadows of his room, though the boy swore he was alone. Days later, he vanished. When police checked his computer, the webcam had recorded an automatic snapshot at midnight. The photo showed him asleep, and in the reflection of his computer screen, another face pressed close, staring directly at the lens. In Kingston, Jamaica, 2005, a girl's family discovered a disturbing series of images on her old desktop. Each photo showed her sitting at the computer, but always from an impossible angle, as if someone inside the screen was photographing her. In the last image, her eyes were closed, her head tilted forward, and a faint handprint was smeared across the glass of the monitor. She was never seen again. By 2007, whispers spread online about the double-click test. Teenagers dared each other to record themselves on early webcams. In the footage, some noticed their reflections on the screen blinked half a second too late. Others claimed the reflection smiled when they did not. Almost every story ended the same. The child disappeared, and their digital files were mysteriously corrupted, as if erased by unseen hands. In Tennessee, 2009, a boy's Xbox Live friends reported something that made headlines in hushed tones. During an online game, his microphone picked up faint laughter after he had logged off. When investigators checked his console, the last saved game screenshot showed his avatar standing motionless before a broken, darkened mirror, though no such mirror existed in the game's design. Australia saw its own digital haunting in 2011. A family reported that their smart TV would sometimes turn itself on at night. The reflection in the black screen showed not the living room, but a corridor they didn't recognize, lined with doors. One evening, their daughter was caught staring at the blank television, whispering as if answering someone. The next morning, her bed was empty, and the TV refused to power on again. Even the UK was not spared. In North Wales, 2013, university students unearthed an old file circulating the dark web. It was a short video clip, just 30 seconds long. It showed an empty dorm room, but the mirror on the far wall contained dozens of faces, pressed close to the glass, staring outward. Most terrifying of all, some students claimed to recognize themselves among those faces. By the time smartphones dominated everyday life, a chilling realization had dawned. Every screen is a mirror now. The barrier that once existed in polished glass had multiplied 1,000-fold. Laptops, tablets, phones in every pocket. There was no longer any escape. The mirror children had adapted to the modern world, and if the old legends were true, they no longer needed glass to reach us. Next, we discover the global pattern emerges. Forensic researchers begin comparing notes, finding eerie connections between these scattered cases across North Wales, Jamaica, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, Kansas, and Australia. By the mid-2010s, a strange development occurred. For the first time, investigators across continents began comparing notes. What had once been dismissed as isolated tragedies or urban legends began forming a pattern too precise to ignore. In Cleveland, Texas, a retired sheriff who had worked missing persons cases for decades contacted colleagues abroad. He had noticed something unnerving. Every unsolved child disappearance in his files shared one common detail. A mirror or reflective surface was present in the room where the child was last seen. At first, it seemed coincidence, but then he read an article from Tennessee describing the same phenomenon. Soon, digital case files were quietly exchanged. What they found was chilling. In Pennsylvania, police photographs of a missing boy's room showed a shattered mirror. When enhanced, faint handprints appeared on the inside of the broken glass, as if something had been pressing outward. In Kingston, Jamaica, hospital records described a child admitted for shock, whispering repeatedly, "They're calling me from the glass." The child vanished from the ward that same night. From North Wales, UK, parish archives detailed an 1891 case of 3 siblings who disappeared from their farmhouse. The only clue, their father had reported hearing knuckles rapping on the inside of the mirror days before they were gone. In Kansas, investigators uncovered rural legends of the other children. Pale figures said to linger in water troughs, window panes, and polished wood. Stories dismissed as folklore, until photos from a 1970s farmhouse resurfaced, showing faint silhouettes standing inside the reflection of a bedroom dresser. And in Australia, coroners found that missing children were often last photographed near darkened glass, television sets, turned-off tablets, black mirrors waiting in silence. Across thousands of miles and centuries of time, the cases whispered the same message. It was never about one family, one house, or one country. This was systemic. Researchers, independent journalists, folklorists, and even a few skeptical detectives began piecing together timelines. They mapped each disappearance, from the Virginia farmhouse of 1834 to the digital hauntings of the modern age. What emerged was not random at all. The incidents rose and fell in waves like cycles of some vast, unseen tide. Roughly every 20 to 25 years, cases spiked across different continents. What terrified them most was the most recent surge. From 2000 onward, the number of unexplained child vanishings tied to reflective surfaces had risen sharply. And unlike before, these cases were no longer confined to rural villages or forgotten towns. They were happening in cities, suburbs, and anywhere a reflective screen existed. One British researcher put it plainly in a private memo later leaked. The mirror children are not bound by place or time. They adapt to whatever we give them, polished wood, glass, silver, then screens. Every generation has built them a doorway, and every generation has paid the price. Theories swirled. Was this folklore stretching across continents? A psychological contagion spreading fear from one culture to another? Or was it something far darker, a shared phenomenon that humanity has been too afraid to acknowledge? The files were clear. Different names, different languages, same core details. Whether in North Wales, Kingston, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, Kansas, or Australia, the story was always the same. Children vanish, mirrors remain, and those who look too closely swear they see faces staring back. By 2015, the global pattern had become undeniable, and if the cycle was true, another wave was already building. Next, we discover suppression and silence. Governments, churches, and institutions quietly burying the evidence, erasing files, and discouraging public panic. But why? What do they know that we don't? By 2016, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Investigators tracing the global pattern of the mirror children had amassed a collection of files, photographs, and witness testimonies spanning continents and centuries. Yet each time they attempted to bring their findings into the light, resistance came, not from skeptics, but from institutions that had quietly guarded these secrets for decades. In the United Kingdom, archivists at the National Records Office quietly reported missing boxes. Entire folders of 19th century parish records, documents detailing child disappearances in North Wales, had been withdrawn without explanation. Researchers noted discrepancies in logs. Some entries had been physically altered, ink scratched away, entire sections removed. A senior historian whispered, "Some things are too dangerous to catalogue." Across the Atlantic, in the United States, attempts to access police and hospital files on disappearances in Pennsylvania, Texas, and Tennessee were met with resistance. Requests for Freedom of Information documents were mysteriously delayed, denied, or misfiled. At least 3 whistleblowers reported receiving unofficial guidance to cease investigation. Emails warning of possible career repercussions were sent from anonymous sources within state offices. In Cleveland, Texas, a retired sheriff admitted that one missing child file he had been reviewing was suddenly marked destroyed due to hazard, without reason or record of authorization. Meanwhile, the church, particularly in rural Appalachia and scattered communities in Jamaica, had a subtler but equally effective hand. Parish priests, elders, and local ministers had long maintained oral histories, quietly discouraging discussion. Photographs, letters, and baptismal records mysteriously vanished from church archives. Older witnesses were encouraged to leave the past alone, or re-esque social ostracism. Families who attempted to report anomalies were subtly threatened or isolated. It was as though the story itself had become untouchable, a dark presence not to be acknowledged. In one documented case, an investigative journalist visiting a small parish in Tennessee found that entire ledgers recording births and deaths from 1930 to 1960 were missing. Local staff initially claimed misplaced during renovations, but the style of excision, pages precisely cut, ink deliberately smeared, suggested deliberate suppression, not accident. Witnesses who attempted to speak publicly were discouraged, sometimes violently. Anonymous letters, threats to revoke pensions, even mysterious vehicle accidents reported in regional papers, never investigated. Australia, too, had its own layer of control. Government agencies quietly monitored rural reports of vanished children near reflective surfaces. Field officers noted that when unusual cases emerged, children disappearing near lakes, glass, or mirrors, the evidence was classified as non-actionable or local folklore. Drone footage capturing pale figures walking in unison through forests was archived under wildlife anomaly and never released despite multiple FOI requests. Some personnel were warned, do not speak of this outside authorized channels. The consistent pattern was clear. Whether it was North Wales, Kingston, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, Kansas, or Australia, systemic suppression ensured the cycle remained hidden. Historians, folklorists, and retired law enforcement officers noticed the same unsettling trend. The higher the institution, government, church, or school, the more aggressively the narrative was erased. Private emails later leaked to independent investigators suggested chilling reasoning. One memo from an unidentified U.S. Federal Archive official read, "Acknowledging these events publicly risks panic, challenges faith, and undermines the social order. Some phenomena are not meant to be understood, only contained. Our task is preservation through silence, containment through silence." Across decades and continents, the mirror children had been quietly monitored, recorded, and erased, not for their own protection, but to protect society from the truth of what they were and who might be orchestrating it. And yet the very act of suppression confirmed one terrifying reality. The mirror children were not confined to time or place. They were a persistent pattern, patiently observed and guarded. Every destroyed file, every silenced witness, every vanished record only reinforced the notion that what humanity feared most was the pattern itself, not the children. By the 2010s, the story of the mirror children had slipped from whispered folklore into the fragmented digital age. The Appalachian ridges, remote creeks, and abandoned hollows that once nurtured secrets were now under constant surveillance by hikers, environmental researchers, and the inevitable proliferation of drones. It was here, in the intersection of technology and isolation, that new evidence began to emerge. In August 2013, two hikers from Hazard County, Kentucky, Jeremy Fields and his scout troop companion, ventured off the beaten path near the old Hollow Ridge Creek bed. Jeremy, a volunteer scout leader and lifelong resident of the area, had heard the legends as a child but had dismissed them. That day, the haze of dusk hung low over the forest, sunlight filtering weakly through dense canopy. They came upon a wooden cross jutting from the mud, roughly lashed with rusted wire. At its base were two pristine canvas shoes, identical, inexplicably clean, and eerily reminiscent of the 1950s era. Scorched into the wood with a heated nail were the words, "Same blood, same soul, same end." No trails led to the site. No campsite had ever existed nearby. The forest had reclaimed all signs of human interference. Fields later admitted in a regional interview, "It felt intentional, like someone wanted us to see it, but only us. The place itself seemed alive, watching." Across the Atlantic, in North Wales, hikers exploring the Snowdonia foothills reported a similar phenomenon in 2014. Two pale children, barefoot, were seen crouched by a reflective lake surface, mirroring each other's movements with mechanical precision. Witnesses described a sensation of time slowing, of unnerving synchronicity. Attempts to approach were met with silence. The figures vanished as quickly as they appeared. Photographs captured were pixelated and indistinct, but unnerving patterns persisted. Twin-like posture, unnaturally aligned limbs, eyes reflecting no light. Meanwhile, aerial drone footage in 2019, deployed as part of a U.S. Forest Service wildfire monitoring program, accidentally captured 15 seconds of movement near Leslie County. On the grainy grayscale clip, two figures, slender, pale, barefoot, moved through dense underbrush. Their limbs swung in perfect unison, heads tilted identically. The software flagged the footage as an anomaly, but human eyes confirmed what technology could not. They moved as one, not two. Internal protocol classified it as wildlife misclassification. The footage was archived, buried under layers of administrative red tape, and never publicly released. Only a single forest technician posting anonymously on encrypted boards revealed it. Hours later, the technician vanished without explanation. Reports also emerged from Kingston, Jamaica, and remote ranches in Kansas and Texas, places geographically distant yet connected by eerie consistency. Witnesses described the same twin patterns, children appearing in pairs, mirroring each other's movements, silent, pale, and impossibly synchronized. One retired Texan rancher recalled spotting two figures wading in a creek, heads cocked toward him in unison. When he blinked, they were gone. No footprints remained, no disturbance in the earth. Even with these modern sightings, researchers noted a pattern of institutional erasure. Police reports, drone data, and local media accounts were altered, misfiled, or quietly suppressed. Social media posts vanished overnight. Anonymous emails warned investigators to stop looking, the pattern is closed. Across decades and continents, the mirror children adapted, appearing where witnesses would be most startled, recorded, but never verifiable. What modern technology revealed, however, was chilling in its implication. The mirror children were not relics of a bygone era. They were evolving, persistent, and aware of observation. Their presence was not confined to Appalachia or North Wales. It extended globally. Every drone frame, every accidental photograph, every hiker's tale indicated the continuation of a pattern deliberately maintained over generations. In Hollow Ridge, locals continued to feel the presence. GPS devices glitched, phones froze, and dogs refused to approach certain areas. The patterns documented in the digital age aligned seamlessly with century-old accounts. Barefoot twins appearing in reflective surfaces, synchronized movements, and the haunting mantra, same blood, same soul, same end. Despite technology's promise of clarity, the mirror children remained elusive. They had learned to inhabit the cracks between observation and understanding, turning modern surveillance into yet another layer of mystique. The digital age had not exposed them, it had documented them, like shadows in high-resolution grayscale, recorded, remembered, but never caught. The story of the mirror children doesn't end with dusty archives or forgotten journal entries. It stretches far beyond Appalachian ridges, beyond the burned remnants of Hollow Ridge, and even beyond the fleeting glimpses captured by drones and hikers. By the 21st century, the pattern, carefully nurtured over decades, had become undeniable, a chilling testament to inheritance, intention, and survival. Local folklore has always served as a vessel for truth disguised as myth. In the case of the Merryweathers, what was whispered in the hollows and relayed at schoolyard fires was the tip of a deeply embedded legacy. Even as children grew into adults, moving to Cleveland, Texas, or Kingston, Jamaica, fragments of the story traveled with them, observations, uncanny encounters, and sometimes dreams of pale twins appearing in the corner of a bedroom or wading silently in reflective water. These echoes of the past reinforced a pattern invisible to most, yet visible to those who dared pay attention. Dr. Marshall Greaves and others before him had glimpsed the architecture behind it. Lila Mae Merryweather's meticulous design of her family's bloodline. She didn't merely isolate, she cultivated, she taught, she constructed the twins to behave in deliberate synchrony. The symmetry, the mirrored postures, the delayed blinks, all served as living evidence of a lineage engineered to endure observation without ever being fully understood. Across the decades, the pattern continued, adapting to the world around it. Where once it was a cabin in Leslie County, now it appeared in shadows, streams, abandoned fields, and the pixelated frames of drones, always two, always identical, always unsettling. Anthropologists, folklorists, and local historians now see the mirror children not merely as subjects of legend, but as a living phenomenon, an inherited protocol enacted through generations. DNA testing, when permitted on discovered remains, showed anomalies inconsistent with natural sibling development. Eye movements, posture, even gait seemed to echo earlier recorded sightings. It was as if time itself had preserved their design, independent of mortality or geography. The message they leave is simple, terrifying. Observation is inevitable, yet comprehension is optional. Hikers in North Wales, drone operators in Kentucky, and campers in Australia or Kansas have all encountered evidence of the pattern's persistence. Every encounter maintains the lesson Lila May intended. The bloodline continues, mirrored, invisible yet unavoidable, echoing silently in every corner where humans dare to intrude. Even technology, the very tool we rely on to document reality, is subverted. Drones record, cameras click, and still the twins evade final capture. Their presence manipulates perception, the blink of an eye, the shifting of shadows, the hesitation of movement. Witnesses report a dissonance between what is seen and what is processed, a lingering unease that is both historical and contemporary, folkloric, yet scientifically unexplained. As we close this story, one thing becomes clear. The Mirror Children are more than a haunting. They are a living record of obsession, isolation, and deliberate design, a warning encoded in the bloodline and carried across decades. The mantra, first carved into a charred jawbone and later etched into wooden crosses, persists. Same blood, same soul, same end. It is not just a statement of identity, but a reminder of the relentless, unbroken pattern that refuses to fade. In the forests of Kentucky, the creeks of Pennsylvania, the ridges of North Wales, and even the sun-drenched landscapes of Kingston, Jamaica, their presence is felt, not always seen. Those who believe see them in peripheral vision, hear them in the hush of wind through leaves, sense them in the way birds refuse certain ridges. Their story is not a closed chapter. It is ongoing, evolving, and entirely indifferent to human curiosity. The lesson for us is unsettling. Some truths cannot be solved, only observed. Some histories cannot be buried, only inherited. And the Mirror Children, in their uncanny symmetry and enduring mystery, remind us that some legacies are far more patient and far darker than we are.